Amara was crossing the street in the late afternoon, the air still warm from the summer sun. The smell of asphalt heated by the sun mingled with that of the light breeze blowing, bringing a semblance of freshness after a stifling day. Amara savored every step she took on the sidewalk, her feet tired but her heart light. She had worked at this posh restaurant for years, a place where forced smiles and polite manners were part of the decor, but where the invisibility of black staff was an unspoken rule. Every evening, after taking off her uniform and leaving the room, she found her breath, her dignity intact despite the fatigue and the inquisitive looks of the customers who passed her. That evening was special. She had finally managed to save enough to buy the books she had cherished for a long time, the ones she wanted to devour to broaden her horizons beyond the boundaries imposed by her daily life. Works on history, philosophy, classics that she had only been able to leaf through in public libraries. Today, she was proud to have accomplished this small victory. That evening, she felt free, light, as if the whole world could do nothing against her, as if all obstacles had evaporated as the pages of the books she was going to read connected her to a larger reality. As she walked down this quiet street, her thoughts wandering between her plans and her dreams, she heard the sound of a vehicle suddenly stopping behind her. The sound of the engine shutting down echoed through the warm air. Amara turned her head and saw a patrol car. 2 police officers, their faces impassive, stared at her through the tinted windows. A shiver ran through her, the instinct for survival pushing her to tense up. She knew those looks too well. These eyes full of prejudice which, in an instant, reduced her to a suspicious silhouette, an unknown person whose simple passage in their field of vision was enough to raise an alarm. "Madam, can you stop, please?" The voice of one of the police officers, more authoritarian than necessary, startled her. Amara, already familiar with this kind of humiliating interaction, stopped without saying a word, her body on alert. His eyes began to scan the surroundings, looking for a way out, a possible escape. But the idea of acting with caution quickly caught up with her. She knew that everything could degenerate in an instant, that the slightest reaction could cause a situation to escalate from which she would probably lose. One of the police officers, tall and imposing, got out of the car exuding an obvious aura of superiority. He approached her with measured steps, deliberate slowness. With every movement he made, Amara could feel the pressure building in the air around her, as if the shadow of the situation was growing heavier and heavier. He looked her up and down, a sarcastic smirk touching his lips. "Do you have any papers?" he asked in a flat tone, for no apparent reason. The tone was more of an accusation than a question, and Amara sensed it immediately. "And quote, I didn't do anything, officer, and quote," she replied calmly, although a dull nervousness crept into her voice. She reached into her purse, searching for her wallet with a precision that she hoped would be reassuring. But every gesture, no matter how innocuous, took on the appearance of a challenge in this charged atmosphere. The other policeman, younger, less confident but just as arrogant, also got out of the car. His gaze scanned Amara with a sort of palpable contempt. "We saw you hanging around the neighborhood. What were you looking for?" he said, smirking, as if he had just discovered a secret that he considered within his reach. At these words, Amara felt a surge of anger rise within her. The neighborhood she was in wasn't hers, but that didn't mean she didn't have a right to be there. The color of her skin, her features, were enough of an excuse for them not to consider her a full citizen. She had heard those lines too many times. The police didn't care what she did or where she went. The mere fact that she was a black woman crossing a neighborhood that they considered restricted seemed enough to arouse their suspicions. "And quote, I'm going home after my day's work, and quote," she said, her voice firmer. She felt her blood boil with the injustice, but she knew that anger could be dangerous. You had to stay calm. But that wasn't what they wanted to hear. They had already created a version of her, a version she wasn't even allowed to react to. Amara suddenly felt trapped, like a distorted silhouette in the eyes of these 2 police officers. "And quote, sit here on the sidewalk, and don't move, and quote," ordered the older policeman. The order was brutal and humiliating. Amara found herself sitting on the warm floor, her purse clutched to her stomach, as if to anchor herself in a reality she had not chosen. Each moment seemed to expand, and yet she knew the situation might get worse. Another vehicle stopped behind the first patrol car. A third police officer got out. He was older, calmer, but his gaze, too, carried the same heaviness of judgment. He approached with a smug smile, as if he already knew everything. "So you know why you're here?" he asked in a condescending tone, while looking at her piercingly. "No, I don't know." "You're stopping me for nothing," she replied, more sharply this time. Her voice had taken on a tinge of annoyance, but she tried to remain calm, aware that any surge of emotion could turn against her. The police ignored her, or rather they accused her in an intangible way, without proof, just because she was there, a black presence in a space that they considered foreign to her existence. They accused him of hanging out, as if it were a crime in itself. They were looking for the slightest flaw to fit her into the mold of their stereotype, to justify their desire to humiliate her. One of the police officers approached her again, leaning slightly over her, dominating her posture. His massive figure seemed to expand, almost menacing. "And quote, we're going to have to take you to the station, and quote," he said in an icy tone. Amara knew the situation was going to escalate. The police officers, whose gaze never ceased to judge her for no reason, represented everything she had learned to avoid: the brutality, the injustice, and the arrogance of the authorities who, often, believed themselves to be above the law. But today, she wouldn't let it happen. Her heart was racing, but she controlled her breathing. Each breath was an anchor in reality, a way to not give in to anger. She knew that in a world like this, her dignity would be her most precious weapon. Discreetly, Amara slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed the button on her phone. Her heart was racing again, but she had to stay calm. This simple gesture, this little thing that we often take for granted, could become his only means of defense. The video would be proof of the injustice she was experiencing, and she hoped she could use it to prove that it wasn't her who was at fault, but them. She tried not to let anything show, but the weight of the situation was beginning to weigh heavily on her shoulders. The police, already too confident in their power, did not suspect that they were being filmed. Amara knew that if she let this opportunity slip away, injustice would win again. The police continued to harass her, but Amara remained calm. She felt the humiliation burning her skin, but her expression remained impassive. The looks they gave her, full of prejudice, were familiar to her, but that evening, she would not give in. The police officers' words, their intonation, their way of speaking to her as if she had no value. All of this struck her deeply, but she was not fooled. She knew they were looking for a reason to demean her, to bring her down to their level. They were trying to get her to react, to see her give in to fear or anger, but Amara knew better. She refused to be their spectator. It was then that the scream pierced the air. A cry that did not seem to come from the police, but from someone in the street. Amara turned her head and saw figures approaching, attracted by the commotion. The sound of footsteps intensified, and soon, a woman in her 40s stopped near the police officers, scrutinizing them with a worried look. She didn't know this woman, but the empathy in her eyes and the intonation of her voice betrayed a desire to understand, to get involved. Amara felt a slight hope rise within her. Maybe this time, someone would make them react. The woman, followed by a man Amara recognized as a senior police inspector, stepped forward with determination. She had already seen this policeman in the neighborhood. He was one of those rare officers who really took their duty of justice to heart, and not that of judging on the basis of prejudice. She had heard of him as a man of principle, one of the police officers with whom it was still possible to talk. The inspector approached, his piercing gaze scanning the scene, assessing every detail. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice full of calm but authority. He turned to the police, who began to mutter clumsy apologies. One of them tried to minimize the situation, but the inspector didn't give them the chance. He interrupted them in a firm tone. "It's over. Let her go." A weight seemed to suddenly lift from Amara's chest, which slowly rose. The distraught police officers looked down, and one in particular avoided his gaze. She could see the defeat in their eyes. The detective looked at her for a moment, as if to make sure she was okay, before waving his hand to guide her towards the patrol car. The woman and man accompanied her, their presence giving Amara a sense of security she had not felt until then. As they walked towards the car, she finally allowed herself a sigh of relief. It wasn't all over, but she had already won a small battle. As she got into the car, she took one last look at the officers, their faces marked with confusion and regret. Amara knew that whatever the outcome, the video she had recorded was the key to her victory. She had barely finished it when she already felt the adrenaline coming down, but her determination remained intact. The next morning, his phone vibrated. The video, which no one could have imagined seeing like this, had started to make the rounds on social networks. Amara, calm and dignified, had become a symbol. She sought neither glory nor recognition, but the truth. The truth about police brutality, the systemic racism that plagues society, and the importance of resistance in the face of injustice. The video went viral within hours. The officers were suspended pending an internal investigation, and comments poured in, expressing outrage and solidarity. Amara had become a figurehead, an example of dignity and courage in the face of a system that had done everything to humiliate her. The press picked up the story, and very quickly, discussions of institutional racism became essential in public debates. The police officers had to face their actions, not only in court, but also in front of an awakened collective conscience. Amara, surrounded by her loved ones and those who had supported her, stood tall, stronger than ever. She was no longer the victim of this injustice, but the voice of a resistance that would no longer be silent. And that evening when she returned home, she knew that her fight would not be limited to this moment. She had just broken a lock, and others would follow.